In this tutorial we're going to create a simple morphing sphere over a gradient background with a slight shadow effect underneath. If I just escape out of this perform mode window, we're going to begin by creating the geometry there with the sphere, with the cameras and the lights and the render, and we're also going to add a material there at the top. So we're basically going to select these and then render them out and then do some basic compositing over the ramp background with our shadow as well added in, and then we're just going to bring that out. We'll start by opening up a new Touch Designer window, and if we can then right click to select all of these nodes, and we're just going to delete all of these nodes out by using the delete button or delete key or backspace key. We can then exit the browser by clicking the X at the top right corner, and this will give us some space. So in order to create geometry, we're going to need first of all our geometry, then a camera, a light, and also a render top, which will allow us to render our geometry out with those other components involved. So we first of all need to double click the network, and we want to, whilst holding shift, or control would be better, but I'm just going to use shift, we can select geometry, camera, light, and then if we switch to our tops in the tab here, we can then lay down a render. So we'll have three comps or components, and we'll also have our render top, and our render top will be referencing each of those components in its parameters. We can edit this by selecting the render top and seeing the camera, geometry and lights which are referenced, and we can switch which ones we want to reference by typing in their names. So the first issue with the geometry that we've created is that we have a torus rather than the geometry that we want, which is a sphere. So in order to create a sphere, we can go inside this geometry component by double clicking, and we can just delete out this torus. So we can right click delete, use the delete key or use backspace, and then we want to double click and select from the SOP menu here, the SOP tab. We want to select a surface operator, which is a geometry based operator. And the sphere is the generator that we want to use, and we want to hold down shift so we can select sphere, and then we want to also select noise, and the noise will deform our sphere with some simple random noise there. So we can use some sparse noise, which is fine, we just want to leave this as its default, and we can make the noise smoother by changing our sphere to a NURBS primitive type. This will see there we can have a smoother image, so this will create a smoother image, and if we go back we can see that we haven't rendered our sphere, it's vanished, and this is due to the render flag being turned off. So here we have the render flag, we can click it to turn it on, and if we scroll out or go back we'll see that we have our render, but we don't have the geometry in our viewer here. So if we want the geometry on our geometry viewer, we have to click the display flag and turn this on, and then if we go back or zoom out, then we'll see that we have our geometry and the render with the noise. So we now have our sphere geometry rendered and ready for compositing, but it's a very simple dull grey, and it would be much more interesting if we could add a material. So we're going to add a material by double clicking the network and selecting under the matte tab for materials. We're going to select a Phong matte. If we then place this down by left clicking, we can left click and drag until the plus appears over Geo 1, let go, and then click Palm Material. The geometry will now reference this material as its main material, so if we go into the display tab we can see that we have Phong 1 there in the material parameter, and we can then set our parameters. So if we want to have a very dark grey, for example, like a very, very dark grey, we could say around about 0.075 for R, G, and B. So these parameters respond to R, G, and B, they correspond to those values. So we can then give it a bit of shininess by, first of all, bringing the specular up, so we've got a much higher specularity, and then also bringing the shininess down, so we can see that we can basically change it where we want, and we can see that in the viewer, and we want it to be around 24. The geometry is now rendered, but the problem is it's very close to the screen. So what we want to do is we want to move our camera so that we can see our geometry a bit smaller. So if we click on the camera component, we can see that we have different translate parameters here. And what we want to do is we can middle click and zoom out and in, so we can see the sphere moving there in the node, and we can move left and right and up and down. So what we want to do is we want to zoom out a little. So if we zoom out by typing in around about 20, then we can see our sphere is now much further away, and we can work with that straight away. The issue now is that the lighting is coming from directly ahead. So if we go onto our light component, we can do the same sort of thing. So for example, right now the light's coming straight on, so we can middle click and see the light move. But we want to set the light to come from the top left. So if we set around about -50 and around about 50 in the Y, we'll now have an X and Y of -50 and 50. So now we're coming from the top left, and we're going to be shining down. If we want it to become directly from the top left, then we can set the Z to 0. So now our sphere is in the render and we have it in a nice position. So now we can go and add a background. So if we double click and lay down a ramp top, then we can begin to manipulate the points so that we have a sort of wall and a floor, but just in a simple ramp. So if we just click some points in here on this bar, and we can drag them down, and you can see I'm sort of creating a kind of split effect where this is going to be the floor about a third of the way down, and I can just brighten that up, and now we've got a sort of nice simple wall behind, and we can start to composite our sphere over the top. So the first issue is that the resolution is going to be wrong because we have 1280 by 720 as our render, and our ramp is only 256 by 256. So if we just change that under the common tab there, and now we can begin to composite by laying down a composite top. So if we right click and select a composite and left click again, and if we just click that ramp and bring that into the composite, we can see that our operation is set to multiply when it needs to be set to over. So if we set it to over now, we have this nice sphere and we have the background all set ready for shadows. So now it's time to add in our shadow effect. So if we just bring down our ramp here, we want to bring in another ramp, and then we want to make it circular so that we can have the shadow created just from a ramp. So if we double click and lay down a ramp, then we can go in and first of all change its resolution to the right resolution. So if we go under the common tab, we can do that. And then we want to set it so it's a radial or circular. So if we set it to circular rather, and then set its periods to around about 1.5, we can have this sort of effect where it's coming out, and we can bring the alpha down on the white there on the key, and we can see that we're still getting a little bit of alpha there. So if we just click on another point and then bring the alpha down for that, then we can kind of choke that ramp in, and we can start to get a bit of an edge. So if we just bring the value down as well, so we don't get it fading to white, and then bring it in, we can sort of choke that ramp down. The next step would be to squash it so that it's the correct sort of the correct sort of angle that we need. So if we lay down a transform top after the ramp, then we can start to use the scale parameter to just squash it in, and then we can use the translate parameter to set it somewhere in our scene. So now we have our composite and we want to just bring this transform in, but the problem is we can't see it because it's at the very bottom. It's the last input there. So if we just bring it up one in the input operations on the component, we can see that it will suddenly appear, but it's in the completely wrong place. So we can go back to our transform and we can start to manipulate that and then bring that down. And it's still a bit dark, so we can lighten it by going back to our ramp, and then we can bring the alpha down to about somewhere lower, about 0.4 there, and it's much lighter. So now that we have our project finalized, it's time to go into perform mode. So if we just lay down in out node in order to bring it out to our project, so if we just lay down this out here, and the out top will now send this back. So if we scroll out of this container, this project 1, we can see that there is our sphere at the wrong resolution. So we need to change the resolution. So under the layout tab here, we can select the width to be 1280 and the height to be 720. This will then make our sphere the right size, and we can just fix the viewer issue by clicking. And if we then decide that we want to go into perform mode, we can just click the button at the top left here, and we can see that we have our sphere on its own. And if we then click and press the escape key, we can come back out, and then we can zoom back into our project again.